The workers of Deir el-Medina were highly valued and well paid. There is even record of workers going on strike to protest grievances.
The people who lived here were not slaves. There's this Cecil B. DeMille image of the royal tombs being built by captives who were then slaughtered to keep the location of the tomb secret, and that simply wasn't so.
Several hundred people at a time would have lived here. Workers were given houses which had been constructed by the state. The houses were organized along passageways which more resembled alleys than streets. There was very little open space outside, but the interiors were comfortable and even contained some furniture.
Furniture was sparse, and yet we have at least three tombs, I guess, from Deir el-Medina's cemetery that had about 25 to 30 pieces of furniture, mostly small wooden chairs and stools.
They clearly worked very hard, but working hard does not mean life was grim. The houses they lived in, although perhaps they were small, would have been quite pleasant places to be.
These low walls are all that are left to us of the houses of Deir el-Medina. Today they appear crude and inhospitable. But for almost 4 centuries, these structures were home to generations of workers and their families. Their home life might have seemed familiar to those of us living 3,500 years later. It's the start of a new work week for the stonecutter who lives in this house in Deir el-Medina. In the summer, even the nights can be really hot, so the family probably slept up here on the roof. He'd come down in the morning and find his kids' toys on the stairs again, walk into this room, the kitchen, where his wife was probably already preparing his breakfast on the hearth here. She'd have got the ingredients from this cool cellar down the steps in the corner, and from the grinding stone over here. What's for breakfast? Well, bread, certainly, and probably cheese, onions, and beer. No, seriously, beer was a very important staple food for the ancient Egyptian. It was low in alcohol content and probably had the consistency of a soup, but you can't have everything. So he'd come here to this small bedroom used in the winter and get dressed. This was not a major problem, as all he had to put on was a loincloth and possibly some straw sandals, although most men seem to have worked barefoot. Then into the all-purpose living room. Now here would be a niche with the household gods, who would themselves be family ancestors. And over here, the seat for the master of the house. Now, these were skilled workmen, so their homes were probably quite pleasant places. Plastered walls, nicely whitewashed, matting on the floor, baskets, wooden furniture. Through here is the front reception room with this daybed in the corner. Shh, mother-in-law's asleep. Now, there'll be no windows in these houses. That's to keep out the heat. But there will be ventilation slots in the ceiling. That would mean that the whole place would be rather dark, but quite cool considering the intense heat of summer. All in all, it's not such a bad place for a workman and his family in around 1200 BC. So it's off to work we go. As the men went off to their jobs, they left behind a fully functioning village. Boys and younger men were organized into crews who replenished food and water supplies from the valley below. Women stayed busy with household chores. They also frequently pursued projects to earn extra money. One of these was selling lamp wicks they wove for the lamps their husbands used as they worked in the dark recesses of the tombs. This is the path that leads to the Valley of the Kings, just over the top of that mountain. That's Deir el-Medina down there. Our stonecutter probably wouldn't see it for another 9 days. That's the length of the work week. During the week, most workers prefer to stay in small huts closer to the tombs in the valley. So perhaps here he would turn to wave goodbye to his wife and children in the village below, and then continue his half-hour hike to his hard work in the tombs. Around 1100 BC, Egypt experienced a period of instability. Outsiders invaded her borders and civil strife was rampant within the country. It's possible that the residents of the village felt exposed and defenseless to the dangers which surrounded them. After 400 years, the workers finally abandoned Deir el-Medina. This place, which had been home to ordinary Egyptians for so long, was soon forgotten. Roofs collapsed, walls turned to rubble, and the village was at last overtaken by the desert sands. More than 30 centuries later, Deir el-Medina lives again. Thankfully, its citizens left many records of their presence. They've given us a wonderful picture of the everyday life which flourished in this barren place so very long ago. The history of ancient societies is revealed in events most often dominated by men. So it is with Egypt. The records left to us detailing Egyptian civilization are filled with the accounts of male kings, priests, warriors, and scribes. But of course, the true history of ancient Egypt is every bit as much the history of her women. The role of women in Egyptian society was quite distinct from other early civilizations. Babylonian, Assyrian, and Israelite societies were dominated by extreme forms of paternal control. Even Greece, the cradle of democracy, treated women as little better than household servants. But in Egypt, it is possible to trace legal equality of women as far back as 2700 BC.
Women in Egypt could go to court, they could own property, they could be a witness, they could sign documents, they could leave their property to whomever they wanted.
I often have pointed out, especially to younger women, that the Egyptian woman, who was regarded by her state as a fully legal, independent legal personality, had more legal rights than some women in the United States up until the 1950s.
As a sign of legal equality, women, just like men, were expected to perform annual service, working on the tombs and temples built each year by the pharaoh. Women ground paint for tomb decoration, wove sandals and baskets for laborers. There is evidence that women even piloted boats on the Nile. Women did not, as a rule, have important positions in Egyptian public and political life. For the average Egyptian woman, the bulk of her responsibilities remained in the home.
The woman's work was in the house. And of course, you have to remember that work in the house was not just the chores of taking out the garbage. It was almost a production industry. Bread had to be made every day. And the women were the ones who were on the millstone. And then the women were the weavers.
In the house, a woman would have to learn how to spin the thread to create enough to put on the loom and weave cloth for the family's clothing. And the process of creating even linen thread involves about 24 steps. So it's amazingly complicated. And a young woman would have had to master this and then learn to weave. And some of it is the finest quality that's ever been produced in the world. It's lightweight and like silk, almost transparent.
In farm families, women would be in charge of tending ducks and geese, but also helped in the field when needed. Women were also responsible for trading farm produce and manufactured items like baskets or pots in the marketplace. A woman's productive life began at 12 or 13. First and foremost, she was expected to find a husband and begin a family. great emphasis was placed on having children early in life.
One has to start here saying that the Egyptian women were among the most beautiful women you have ever had. Long legs, small breasts, very upright stance, and you have these beautiful hips, long arms, almost dancers' bodies.
Courtship seems to have been very informal and surprisingly without much ritual or restriction. Relations between young men and women were also anything but prudish.
The love poetry seems to suggest that there was a sexual relationship before marriage in many cases, at least in the cases of the love poems, a young man, a suitor, would be visiting the young lady in her house, or a young woman would run out of her house to find her lover in his bed. So there's quite an explicit portrayal of sexual love before marriage.
Even in ancient times, romance was often expressed with music. Egyptians loved their music, and it was part of all aspects of their lives. Sadly, we have no clear idea what Egyptian music sounded like, but we do have the words to some of their songs. This is part of a love song, sung by a woman to her lover, whom she calls her brother. My brother, it is pleasant to go to the pond in order to bathe in thy presence, that I may let thee see my beauty in my tunic of finest royal linen when it is wet. Fairest one, my desire shall be that if my brother cannot be with me tonight, then am I like him who is in the grave. For art thou not health and life? You know, they don't write them like that anymore. Girls were eligible for marriage as soon as they reached puberty. Boys were slightly older, between 16 and 20. Although the courtship of a young couple might have been thoroughly romantic, the actual event of their marriage certainly was not.
Marriage in ancient Egypt was an institution, but not a sacrament. So far as we can tell, for example, there really was no marriage ceremony. A couple of families would agree that a couple should be married, or a couple might agree to marry with their family's support, but there was no real marriage ceremony.
Virginity was not a requirement of a bride or groom, but after marriage, fidelity was taken very seriously.
Once people were married, it was assumed that they would be faithful to each other, and actually, from what we know from the writings of the sages of the time, this applied to both the husband and wife. Fidelity in marriage was regarded as the proper way of life.
Divorce was not uncommon among Egyptians, and either partner could initiate the process. There was no social stigma. Divorced men and women frequently remarried. In spite of their attitude about divorce, the institution of marriage was at the very center of Egyptian society.
The ancient Egyptians often are shown with arms around one another, husbands and wives, and it's very sweet because it's not a huge demonstration of affection, but it's very discreet, and they both look very happy. The idea of family and a sense of affection and love for one another was very strong in ancient Egypt, just as it is today.
It's tempting for modern society to assume that technology has given us some unique perspective on life, which the average person in ancient Egypt could not have known. But this sort of cultural bias denies the facts of the history of this place. It's very clear that the ancient Egyptians loved their country, treasured their families, and sought the same peace and contentment as we do thousands of years later. The basic elements which make life worth living were as treasured by these ancient peoples as they are by those of us who occupy our own place in time.